Well, let me welcome you officially to the Social Contract Research Network seminar. It's an unusual and great pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker for this evening, the Melbourne evening, Associate Professor Justin Clemens from Melbourne University. I was trying to think earlier today when I first met Justin, I think it was in 2007, when he and Oliver Felthen gave what was really a mesmerizing presentation over at the Crash Building in Cambridge, England. And I remember on that day, I was sitting next to a friend, and my friend was holding a book that he just bought called L'Éthique by some obscure French thinker that I'd only vaguely heard of at the time called Alain Badiou. And needless to say, from that point, my acquaintance, both with Badiou and with Justin's work, has gathered quite a pace. I think it's fair to say that my own interest and understanding of Badiou has been in large part facilitated by Justin's work, as I'm sure it has been indeed for many of us here. And I always think it's a good sign of a book's quality if you can remember where you were when you first read it. And I can certainly remember precisely where I was when I first read Justin and Oliver's introduction to Badiou in Infinite Thought. And I also remember exactly where I was when I first read The Romanticism of Contemporary Theory. So I'm particularly delighted that Justin's accepted my invitation to speak at the seminar this evening. He's going to speak for around 30 to 40 minutes or so. And then the rest of our time, I trust, will be pleasantly occupied with discussion and questions. If you've got a question at any point, just feel free to write it in the chat. And then I'll run through them in the order that they come in the chat at the end of the talk. And Justin's title for today is Badiou, Rousseau, and the Social Contract. So please do join with me in welcoming Justin Clemens.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for your invitation and for your introduction. We might talk about difficult atheism a little later, depending on how things transpire. And thank you, everyone, for coming wherever you are, whether in Melbourne lockdown or elsewhere in the world. As you will quickly hear, while I think the social contract is an extremely important theme to raise again in these deleterious days, I also think that the return of any putative social contract today is not simply highly unlikely, but perhaps impossible. As my abstract has proposed, I'll be speaking primarily about how I see Badiou's work as intervening into this question of social contract, and particularly with regards to two major aspects of his theory in his 1988 treatise, Being an Event: the account of political will in Rousseau, and Badiou's own account of the constitution of the state. Given the time limits, I think it'll be much more heavily weighted towards the first. And unlike the brilliant presentation of Peter Horwood earlier in this series, however, my account of Rousseau itself will be rather thin. Essentially, I'll just be glossing Badiou's own account in that book, rather than a discussion of Rousseau's texts in any substantial detail. And if that wasn't enough, I'll begin, moreover, with some general establishing remarks about the status of, about some general orienting remarks, I guess, about the status of the social contract in the historical sequence that runs from Hobbes to Rousseau. And these preliminary remarks, perhaps they'll be rather remedial, will focus on some conditions that I see as important in the emergence of the discourse around the social contract in the first place, before I proceed to speak more directly about Badiou. The phrase, the social contract, is handy if a little obscure, as if you were coming to it for the first time, as if there was a non-social contract or a social non-contract and a non-social non-contract possible, giving us a square of semiotic possibilities, for instance. But of course, that's not at all how the social contract is understood by its major figures, because it's really rather a question of both an irreducibility and a transition between two different situations, that of contract and that of nature. And since as contract is by definition social and nature has no contractual obligations to you whatsoever, it's a very particular kind of intensifier. The term social hence modifies the kind of contract that's at stake. That is, social designates in itself the modifiability, variegation, and indeed, crucially, the potential breachability of any contract, here denoting as binding a multiplicity of persons for a limited time on the conditions of a kind of de facto volition. And it's also determining, however, in social, what we call social contract theory, that it's not just a sense of this or that contract that's at stake, but the very possibility of the form of contract itself. How is it that we can ever go from a non-contractual situation to a contractual one, and hence this paradoxical possibility of contract is right at the centre. As an etymological curio, I'm not sure if this has been mentioned before in the series, perhaps it has. The word itself enters English in the 14th century, partially from French, partially from Latin, where it refers at first to the social war of ancient Rome, and therefore has the sense of a war fought between allies. So social in English first means a war between allies, but also it pertains to the matter of conjugal or marriage relations too. Perhaps also a war fought between allies, but these are its I guess primary senses in English. Obviously, it very quickly comes to be applied in a recognisably contemporary sense of sociability, of affability, companionship, and so on. Perhaps it's not exactly then Freud's sense of the antithetical significance of primal words, but it's still suggestive that the origins of sociality are in a war between allies. As for the sense of nature, the term, with the introduction of the theories of the social contract, nature concomitantly undergoes a kind of sea change, one surviving at the heart of every polity, as we'll see, yet overburdened, camouflaged, and itself become volatile and obscure. And so, just to be punctual about this, I suppose, from Hobbes to Rousseau, integral to the theories of social contract is first of all the question of genesis, that is, from one state to another state. And so the question of a transition between heterogeneous states becomes an integral part of political philosophy, which is simultaneously, and this would be a kind of obvious, I suppose, a question about origins, whether it's the origins of states themselves out of a putative state of nature, or indeed the radicalisation of the question of origin as such from the 17th century on. For instance, it's as a good book by Philip Petit on Hobbes's theses around language has shown. Probably Hobbes is at the origin of the idea of an origin of languages itself, a question that seems not to have been raised so expressly or directly by anyone before him. So along with the question of genesis enters the question of multiplicity, because of course there are many different kinds of social contract, as one can get at a glance from history, or even the contemporaneity of a 17th century Europe, which is pretty much offers a number of very different political situations. And along with genesis, multiplicity, we also have contingency. It seems, precisely because of the question of genesis and multiplicity, that there's a certain contingency to every social contract, every state that we see around us. And with contingency also offers, fourthly, the question of inconsistency too, the residues of the state of nature in a state of law, the threats of civil war or dissolution that constantly menace an established polity from without and within, other limits, whether pragmatic or essential, that might bear upon the problem of contract. And finally, and this is obviously going to be crucial for someone like Rousseau, the question of legitimacy then. Or to put this another way, the problem of contract and consent. Is there a best polity, or is there no longer a best polity? From where and how can one gauge the differences between polities, evaluate, rank them, otherwise participate or not participate in them, give one's assent or withdraw it? So all of these things become very, very paradoxical from at least from Hobbes on. So in these terms, many of the traditional terms of political philosophy, sovereignty, authority, obedience, legitimacy, and so on, if evidently maintained in the modern social contract theories, they do take on an entirely new cast. And as I flagged, the paradoxes that these throw up are part of their interest. And I'll note here that the paradoxes themselves, let's say, a symptom of yet unformalizable urgencies. One of the fundamental questions of the social contract, as we know, is what are the fundamental ties and binds of society? And from the very beginning, the social contract theories throw up the problems of murder and money. In Hobbes, of course, the tie of society is the attempted foreclosure of the universe of war and mass murder. And even if we go forward or project forward beyond Rousseau to modernism and to contemporaneity, we still find attempts to sort of answer this question, if in different registers. So for Nietzsche, the oldest festive joy of mankind is spectacular cruelty, which is in fact a bind and tie of society. And Freud, of course, another late inheritor of social contract theory, it's the virtual guilt of a primal murder, and so on. As Ernst Jünger's Venator asserts in the novel Humersville, equality is based, as we have seen, on the possibility that anyone can kill anyone else. That is, the subject becomes a citizen only insofar as its mortality is taken in charge by the state. Or again, as in a more ironic mode, as John Locke puts it, the state can kill you, but can't go through your pockets. So money is one of the bourgeois answers to the question of the tie of society. But whatever position that's taken on this question, it remains obscure and paradoxical, and we'll see this in more detail with respect to Rousseau shortly. And this paradoxicality has questions of for the kind of contract that's involved, or the proto-contract, crypto-contract, or the thing that's between nature and contract, also has consequences, as I mentioned before, for the state of nature itself. Does the state of nature, is it a useful fiction of the theory? Is it a real state presented by the theory? Is it a real or fictional residue of a past state within the present state, or some combination of all these, or indeed something else? And one of the things we can no longer decide if what the state of nature is actually doing. Is it real or fake? Is it false? Is it artificial? Is it a residue that's projected backwards, and so on and so forth? But whatever else it does, it projects a temporal angst into the heart of the fiction of the state itself, leaving the tension between history and structure in the social contract theorists at once patent and irreducible. Another set of questions that emerge concern the question of how political change occurs. What sorts of changes are possible not just from nature to contract, but from within an established sovereignty, it's a sovereign power itself. So the question of the foundation of and destruction of polities becomes central, and the figure of the nomothete, the legislator, the lawgiver. Think of the new political importance of a figure such as Moses from the 17th century on. Obviously, an absolutely critical figure in the history of in the constitution of monotheism, but he takes on a new properly political purpose as a result, given that he becomes an image of the operator between diverse states, and in fact between slavery and becoming and the formation of the Jewish people and so forth. And at the same time, it also has to be recognised that politics goes through the variable singularity of something we'll call the social, not individuals, families, inheritances, but a certain, the social equals X. What is it? A certain excess at the heart of the problem itself, which has at once a statist character, concretized as a particular form of polity, but also simultaneously, as I'm saying, as a sequence of ongoing modifications. This is one of the things that makes the social contract theorists of modernity different from simply inheritors of the custom nature division that Leo Strauss saw as essential to the origins of political philosophy per se in ancient Greece. So, very quickly, or relatively quickly, actually not at all quickly, the theories of social contracts start to become simultaneously historical, empirical, anthropological, packed with details from across histories and geographies, and ahistorical simultaneously, insofar as they purport or have the ambition of giving an account of the constitution of policies through theoretical accounts of the genesis of the diverse forms of binding of diverse human bodies. And I've mentioned this is also a new kind of experience of time. In the very interesting discussion, this current series with Stuart Eldon and Mark Kelly, for instance, we saw the question of Georges Dumézil's position regarding the ancient divisions in sovereignty, for instance, of Mitra and Varuna, or the idea that the social contract as an exterminatory tendency are raised as a result of, I think, the tension that social contract should actually indicate. I think they're wrong about this, but you can see that the doubleness of sovereignty as a unified division of government, yes, it's there. Yes, you can see exterminatory tendencies, but it's certainly possible to see these sorts of things functioning, say, in the notorious frontispiece to Hobbes' Leviathan, in the two columns under the image that flank the title details. In the frontispiece, there's the war machines to the left, but also the cannons of warfaring dialectic on the right. And yet, this being said, something else is missing or lacking or not fully explained by that ancient double characterization. For instance, as Janice Richardson points out very clearly in her own contribution to this series, it's vital to underline the patriarchal misogyny of the social contract too. And I can recommend her article on Hobbes's frontispiece, but also to say that this question makes the social contract more complicated than the reductions that are often made of it. But to put this in terms that will receive further elaboration shortly, the emergence of the social contract as a central topic for politics and philosophy is the moment at which the relationships between state, changes and events is at once coming to be formalised, yet elements are not fully separable. I think this is essentially Badiou's position, in fact. Thinking in the social contract can no longer take one or another form of governance as the sole and single centre and ideal or ambition of political life, but rather beginning to acknowledge, apparently sort of counterintuitively, that the state itself may not be the essence of the political, but perhaps even merely the residue of a political truth. If that's the case, what's the essence of politics? For Badiou, it becomes linked, as you might know, to what he calls the event, or indeed in the social contract theorists, it's an act, a revolutionary act, and a revolution in the sense of introducing an unpredictable and irreversible change into the situation from which it's emerged. And this, in fact, is how Badiou interprets Rousseau's social contract. On the one hand, we have established polities, which Rousseau, as you know, everywhere he confronts, he sees only corruption and a falling away from the natural simplicity of the state of nature. And on the other hand, we have the act, or in Badiou's terms, the event of the general will. This dialectic, even this non-relation between what we could call the state and the event, provides the focus of meditation 32 in being an event. There are a number of major meditations on the event in being an event that are not meta-mathematical or formal. Mallarmé and Rousseau, Hölderlin and Pascal, for instance. But if the meditation on Mallarmé is an account of the pure form of the event, as you'd know if you know that book, and for which Mallarmé's poem Coup d'idée provides the critical matrix, the meditation on Rousseau has a slightly different inflection and concerns the extraction of the relation between an event, its nomination, and its continuation out of and separation from the structure of sovereignty itself. So for Rousseau, and this is very, very important to pick up on some of the things I was saying before, his investigation of the social contract is not and cannot be strictly empirical. It certainly bears on the existence of states, but the existence of politics is not a question answered by the existence of states. Already a very, very fundamental, if difficult to comprehend rift within Rousseau's presentation. But Rousseau also, neither existence nor necessity, for instance, a la Hobbes, an exit from the war of all against all, is going to account for the emergence of such polities. And so this is an extremely profound and bizarre intervention of Rousseau's, the very thing, the social contract begins by actually doubting that existence and necessity are going to be able to have any explanatory power when it comes to the question of politics as such. In fact, for Rousseau, and Badiou does a lot of work to emphasize this, the states that confront us, here, there, everywhere, are in fact shells whose laws are in fact vacant. And rather than them constituting the essence of politics, they're apolitical, anti-political, or simply non-political. For Badiou, this means that Rousseau, when in the social contract, is not discussing the being of structures, as we certainly still could assign it to Hobbes, or the structuring of structures, but rather the chance of events. Whereas, as Rousseau says, the contract must be the moment before which there are only particular wills, and after the intervention, only a general will. It's kind of a paradoxical event. We start with all, but there's no general will in sort of natural, in the state of nature or states of nature. There's only particular wills. When there's a collection of persons, that's just maybe the will of all, but it's not a general will. But afterward, and so there's no constituted sovereignty. So something like the general will crystallizes itself according to a torsion, which both presumes its existence before it could have taken place. The contract has to be considered as belonging to itself, in fact, and auto-belonging. And in doing so, it's a singular torsion. This is Badiou's only vocabulary, which doesn't partake of any particularity, but neither does it speak, as I mentioned before, to any established reality, despite the fact that something of the kind has to have happened in order that there be something more than just a collection of individuals without any binding principle. Or indeed, the shells that are states, all of them, just their very existence presumes that something of the kind must have happened at some stage, even if there's been this evacuation of the spirit of the laws. So this general will too then isn't simply present in any of the states that it must have founded. Paris, as you know, in Rousseau, is one privileged name for a polity lacking in anything but the horrors of amour-propre. Not being present, however, it still nonetheless has to have left some trace of itself that even in its corruption and its vitiation is nonetheless capable of being, perhaps, occasionally, by chance, of being revivified. And so you can see that this is part of the point of Badiou's discussion of the event in this particular way, in not just the question of the event itself and the paradoxical its paradoxical nature, which of course Badiou has discussed elsewhere in Being Event, but also the problem of the continuation or the maintenance, the sustenance of that. Of the consequence of that event in the very states that nonetheless have vitiated and betrayed it. So the general will for Badiou is not simply, it doesn't simply name the event, but it's simultaneously a mode of binding, what Badiou will also call later in Being an Event, an operator of fidelity. Now, this has a number of further paradoxes. And one of them is that we accordingly find split subjects throughout Rousseau's work, between nature and civilization, between amour de soi and amour-propre, between the citizen and the subject, and so on and so on. However, not all of these divisions line up at all neatly with each other. And in fact, one of the divisions, citizen-subject, is a division that is both it's not good and bad, good versus bad, or they're not others of each other. They're utterly split and yet intimately connected. And they have to be because for Rousseau, the indissociable doublet that is the citizen subject is composed of a citizen that is a participant, a real participant in the general will, and then the subject that is subject to the laws that derive from that aforementioned general will. So both bearing a trace of the event and constituting a fidelity to that event, and the laws to which the subject is subject, those specific, cannot be particular insofar as precisely such particularity ends up being tied to the empty decrees of the established political entities of which I spoke before. And so we have this very strange, not only this paradoxical torsion of the general will, in which what Rousseau will then call the citizen, to which the citizen for which a citizen is the name of an individual that participates in the whole that isn't really an individual, and so isn't an individual. And then the subject, which follows the trace of the citizen into the laws of the city, but not the laws that we call laws, but the true spirit of the laws within the laws, but which have now become simply the shell of decrees. And so we have a vanished paradoxical event, that of the general will, which nonetheless has to have happened for anything to have happened, and at the same time its continuation through a fidelity, and this in the subjects that take up that the question of the equality of the event, and that citizen and the subject must be one and the same, must be both divided and present in one and the same person, but not reducible to simply the representability of a public decree. And this obviously is an exceedingly fraught and paradoxical presentation. But it means, moreover, for Rousseau, the essence of the general will has to be considered equality before freedom. The individual can't be free in any, received sense with respect to the general will, which is expressed in it precisely insofar as it is citizen, but nor can it be anything outside that general will that is not except by becoming a natural particular or a derivative of interest. Freedom then in Rousseau, and this is also, I think, very important, freedom depends on equality. And the will, the general will, can be represented therefore only by itself. It can't be transmitted or alienated or divided. And this again picks up a distinction I've already mentioned between the will of all and the general will. The latter always pertains absolutely equally to the whole. Yes, this also has the upshot, and I've been trying to describe this, I guess, that the laws to which the citizen is subject are not represented, nor even in principle representable, because the represented laws, the laws represented to which the citizen, to which the subject citizen is precisely a subject, insofar as it's both a citizen and following on from the citizen in and of itself, follows laws that are not laws as we know it, or rather the laws within the laws, or the spirit of the laws, or something of the kind. So not only is the general will itself a vanishing and paradoxical torsion, but its continuing function as an orientation for politics is indiscernible from the point of representation. It cannot be identified by any operations of knowledge in the situation. It looks like nothing, or it looks like something else, or it looks like a phantasm. And since it's other to all decrees, it simply cannot be brought back under their jurisdiction. They can't even be used as a kind of searchlight to recognize it. We have all of the consequences that we know from the craziness of Rousseau. Factions, parties, demographics, numerical data operations are necessarily themselves external to politics proper. What trace does the general will leave? It appears only as a paradox within situations, if not entirely nugatory, and the statements in the present that are connected to it can, by the same token, not be factional demands. So we have either the question of politics in action, unrepresentable, unplaceable, concerning the generality of the people, or they're not. So, of course, there are many, many issues. Maybe what are the consequences? What are the consequences of Rousseau's social contract? Perhaps too soon to say, but The two that Badiou in particular takes up in this meditation is firstly, who's the legislator or bearer of this general will for the first part, and secondly, how can it be sustained given its paradoxical and indiscernible nature? As we know, for Rousseau does not in the slightest hesitate from expressing as clearly and directly as can be. What an incredible writer! Just how paradoxical this legislative figure is. A singular figure, neither particular nor recognisable. They must be the name of the legislator of the event. They name the event of which they're a part, but being subtracted from its effects precisely because they're nominators of it, they too turn out to be a kind of supplementary vanishing mediator, necessary to the event, but also integrally connected to it, but also separable from it, except only in a kind of theoretical way. And so we have this vanishing event, the torsion of the general will, and then we have the legislator, which can't be simply sucked in, who names the event, but is also separable from it. We have once again, Moses can't enter the promised land, as we know, as Rousseau says. We find similar to this is one of the paradoxical statements of which he's so fantastic at expressing. We find simultaneously in the work of legislation two things that seem incompatible: an enterprise surpassing human powers, and to execute it, an authority that is a mere nothing. For Badiou, then, the general will is the vanishing event that is then named as such by the paradoxical figure of the legislator, which then enjoins the continuation. For example, Moses, paradox, bringer of laws, moving from slavery to a constituted people, then promises a land which he can't himself enter, and so forth. But who, as Rousseau says, the spectacle of the Jewish people over the last 2,000 years without land and so forth is an incredible anomaly. So, however, you can see the dialectic. It's the continuation that Rousseau is unable to think through, at least in Badiou's presentation here. It means whenever Rousseau tries to think about how the citizen subject can continue from the general will, the legislator, the citizen who participates in the general will and therefore is not quite the legislator but is an absolutely equal with all the others that participate and so on. And the subject that continues is that Rousseau, whenever he tries to discuss the principles of such a continuation, he has to have recourse to the very things that he's already placed out of its bounds. Above all, the problem of the return of the count. Numbers, factions, data, knowledge always comes back in his attempt to discuss how the unanimity and indivisibility of will, the general will, can continue into these polities. Obviously, there's a serious problem of adjusting the laws stemming from the will with the contingencies of what happened. For instance, even allowing Rousseau, okay, there's a continuation. Events happen all the time that threaten polities, which threaten to divide the citizens from the subject, and hence the continuation of the general will. Now, whereas reactionary thought invariably falls back on what's already established as the control, I always, in this context, think of Burke's response to the French Revolution: "Give me the rights of an Englishman. No universal rights, no human human rights." Rousseau's radicality makes this impossible. He can't fall back on what's already established as if it should control what should happen. And so even if we said, yeah, okay, Rousseau, you've got your citizen, you've got your subject, you've got good laws which these subjects are following, threatened by an event from outside. What do? Do you just fall back on the established laws? Well, you can't. Rousseau can't do that, even though that would be an eminently, as I say, conservative or reaction response. Rather, and this is where we have another symptom, Rousseau falls back on the image of, rather than the legislator, the dictator, a figure obviously drawn from Roman law, who has to suspend the laws under the condition of emergency in order to preserve them. And once again, getting into all of the paradoxes and rather unfortunate consequences that are familiar to us. And such a figure, as I've said, is a kind of double and inversion of the legislator himself. Now, I haven't crapping on too long, but the key thing is to just here emphasize that what Badiou wants to say is that in this sequence of the social contract, what matters in the social contract for Rousseau in particular is that Rousseau brings the tension within what we call social contract theory to its absolute height between the question of established sovereignty and the events and the powers that make that possible. And Rousseau very, very radically discusses the problematic of equality as found, equality is found in freedom in this question of the general will. The follows through courageously on the paradoxes of this will, but at the same time hasn't been able to separate, despite Rousseau's clear hostility to civilization in a number of texts, and to his explicit express attacks on the emptiness of laws. He still can't fully separate his position from the state. And this is exactly as what Badiou says, well, we ourselves can do that today. Today, as one commentator has put it, the basis of security policy is not a social contract, but rather a security pact between state and population that explicitly transgresses the legally defined limits of state intervention. And as we can see in the global pandemical politics today, as Mark Kelly puts it in a blog post for the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy, plague proportions, what a mouthful. There's a rift between biopolitics today, that is the biosecurity of vast populations, and economics, the necessity to keep capital circulating freely, in a new dialectic between nature and freedom. Nature now understood as a kind of epidemiological control, and freedom as free enterprise, free capitalist exchange, unconstrained by biological necessities, and both of these on an irreducibly global scale. I'd note that in itself, this would make any social contract impossible in any of the modern senses. Biosecurity concerns precisely foreclose any consent or contracting through words, though we can discuss this as well, as they concern transactions at a kind of vectorial molecular level. And the precondition for this is precisely the technical domination of informatics, such that at the level of information, there's no longer any real difference between bodies and languages. For Badiou, this dialectic between, I guess, the global economy of the free market and unconstrained capital, and the epidemiological control of what's left of traditional nation states, this dialectic is in fact internal to his theory of the state as such. Such a state, as Badiou theorizes, it then can't be reduced to the nation state, the sorts of sovereignty familiar from the social contract theorists, or even the sorts of theories of sovereignty criticized by someone like Michel Foucault. Rather, it's a state of knowledge power representations, massively in excess of any particular situation, and itself unconcerned with any apparent inconsistencies. Its fundamental operation is just to re-represent everything that is represented again and again and again, literally infinitely. As such, the state is in Badiou's account, is pure privatization according to the particularization of predicates. Any unary trait, essentially, they're bundling and rebundling. And its operation is this of the doubling down of the one. Nothing that is not one can be counted except as the one that it is not. And I think the appropriate image of the contemporary state, as Badiou is theorizing it, would be something like the AI database rather than the modern bureau, an accelerated and human repetition of what already exists unto absolute inequality. And so this is part of his reformalization of the state. We can speak about that if you like. But But what it concerns is, as you could probably almost hear, is itself a radicalization of that Rousseauistic dismay and despair at the state of civilization. Paris is an empty shell. In fact, wherever you look, all of these different states and policies around the world are no longer connected in any way with general will, and indeed have fallen into desuetude. On the other hand, there's a question of what Badiou calls the activity of a political truth. Excuse me. Precisely his reconceptualization of the Rousseauian will begins in an anomalous locality, is undecidable and discernible, continues according to its own singular proceedings, is self-sustaining, and is essentially equalizing. Moreover, it no longer aims at the takeover of the state or a recrudescence of power, although eventually, too, in Badiou, the state itself will have to come to pick up the new discoveries that this political process has made. But to conclude and to come back to the minimal central thesis of this presentation. The social contract is a moment of formalization of politics at the point where the difference between politics as a process of militant change and as a theory of state is emerging, but without being able to be fully identified, or these two aspects being fully separated. In this sense, Badiou divides the false one into a real two. Today, however, at least from Badiou's point of view, we can fully formalize this difference as the event-truth process on the one hand and the state on the other, even if, as I said, finally the state will reuptake all the elements of truth that the former produces. And a quote from Immanence of Truths, his most recent text, which I think is about to appear in English. It was originally slated for this year, but I think it's been somewhat delayed due to COVID. But this is the quote. In this sense, the precarious work whose future is the archive is coupled to the state if we agree to say that a state is in fact a concentration of the state of oppression at a given moment. But the precarious work is not the state. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Justin, for such a rich presentation that could take us in any number of different directions, and I'm sure will in the time that we've got for discussion now. Peter has put a question in the chat, and can I invite anyone who'd like to ask a question or make a comment, because there are so many of us and I probably won't see you. Just put a note in the chat and I will call on people in the order that those questions come in. So Peter, could I invite you please to turn on your microphone and ask your question? Thank you.
Ooh.
Sorry. Yeah, I wondered if Justin could expand on this concept of the spirit of the laws for Rousseau, and what this meant for Rousseau. If there were any, this was his concept, or someone else's concept. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. It's a really good question. Unfortunately, I was using it rather loosely, but for Rousseau himself, it's very crucial that, for instance, of course, you can find antecedents to the idea of the distinction between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, which obviously has in this case a Pauline provenance, but it's not at all a theological references that he seems to be enamored by in this case. In fact, it's even though he's the Savoyard vicar and so on, it really is a kind of strange relationship, praise of a kind of a praise of a kind of atheistic God. Although I say that with a lot of reservations and not very confidently. But the key thing is that, yes, there is a well-developed distinction between the spirit of and the letter of the law. It's not quite what Rousseau means by this. What he means to say is that there are laws that the citizen subjects follow, which are given to them by themselves insofar as they have participated in the general will, and they are continuing to bear that general will forward. However, it's precisely unrepresentable according to the laws of the state, which he thinks are precisely vitiations and kind of empty shells, which have lost actually the touch, any touch with this general will itself. And so that's whether or not there's a proper antecedence to that, the particular way that Rousseau is making that distinction, I'm not sure. I think Rousseau is probably a decisive moment at least in a transformation of that that relationship, because it for me it no longer, although there's obviously people here who know a lot more about this than I do, I don't see that as a particularly Christian distinction anymore. It's a new kind of thing, I think.
Wonderful, thank you. Adam, could I invite you to ask your question, please?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Justin, I find you a little bit pessimistic on the question of the recuperation by the state of any possible sort of truth procedure. I guess in the political sense, the idea of it ultimately is that if it is able to continue and to proceed and to, act and formalise in the way it does within a given situation, there is the possibility of building an entirely new collective which organises itself on the basis of that equality inscribed in the event and so on. You know the idea here. I mean, maybe you were just like cutting to the end sort of thing, but the idea that it just returns to the state, suggested in the way that you presented it, that whatever state there was in the original sense will just eventually collect all that back up and will carry on as normal. Yes. In the sense where it doesn't matter if the revolution happened, it would have gone that way anyway, that sort of formulation that you might see in a rent or something. Yeah. So just if you want to speak more a little bit about that, and maybe, I can't remember how this works in Rousseau or even if he goes that far, but if there's if he has some particular outcome, which is remains other than the state in that sense. Yeah.
That's absolutely crucial. I think that the slightly pessimistic inflection that you discern me as having put upon this itself is a question of having read it or having to reread a lot of Rousseau recently, and which is the most amazing experience, I have to say. But the pessimism, he's both unbelievably pessimistic and paranoid, and unbelievably radical and not at all melancholic at the same time. And I guess the tenor of my discourse tonight comes from trying to say, well, does Badiou speak about the social contract? And if he does, well, he definitely speaks about Rousseau. What is it about Rousseau that's crucial? And he wants to say the things that I've said. It's not that everything will end up, it's not that everything exists, the universe exists to end up in a book, as Mallarmé says, or every truth exists to end up in the state. That's not at all the case. That's a kind of exactly what I would say, something like the reactionary model of Edmund Burke saying, give me the rights of an Englishman. Rousseau's problem is a different one. He needs to continue the general will forward, and that's absolutely key. However, he also recognises that he doesn't have that there's some problem for him in thinking how that general will, in the terms of his own theory, how that general will can be pushed forwards, to come back to Peter's question before, because the laws that states actually give are not actually the laws that are connected to the general will. They're the shell of the laws of the will, right? Or their parodies or representatives thereof. And so Rousseau doesn't have the conceptual tools for making that disintrication. The point for Badiou, however, is actually from the point of view of the present, we can disintricate them theoretically and give a formal distinction, which shows that, yeah, even if everything, the state will always come chasing, no matter whatever is produced. But the political process itself has nothing to do with the state. It doesn't aim at the state. It's self-supporting. It can always be continued. The state, it's no longer a takeover of the state, for instance, and it's no longer the form of a social contract as such in a traditional sense, although maybe in a new Badiouian sense, because this remains forever. It will remain entirely unrepresentable in its essence. Did that make sense to you?
Yep. Thanks, man. Good.
Thank you, Adam. Valerie, please.
Thank you, Justin. I think I have a question. Hello. I really love the tension in Rousseau between this longing for a natural state, this nostalgia for being pure, and the state essentially. And I love this tension. I think spiritually this tension is really important for everyone.
Yeah.
Would you say that in Badiou, again, I'm not particularly familiar, but would you say that in Badiou there's a analogous tension as well between the event and the state? That's the question I think that I try to form. But something interesting I wanted to say, because probably you don't know how event is said in Russian, and I think it makes, to me at least, much more sense in terms of meaning, semantics, and things like that. So in English, event for me, I don't know what it really means. Event is event.
Yeah.
In Russian, event is, and Heideggerians would love it, it's called событие. And событие, if I were to translate it into English, means with being. And with being, I would say, is a state of nature.
All right, that all makes like a lot of sense, and that's an amazing sort of. I like the idea of with being, like in Badiou, there isn't the nostalgia that we see, that spiritual. That I mean, in Rousseau, there's no question. There's the distinction between this amour de soi and amour propre, the state of nature, and then states of contract. Everything's a failure, and there's a nostalgic longing in Rousseau. But he's also incredibly radical with it, as I've been trying to suggest as well, in which it's not maybe just the state of nature, nor the contract as such, the constituted polity, but there's something that Rousseau's aiming at that is neither one nor the other. And that's what Rousseau calls general will, in which Badiou tries to reconceive from his own point of view as event. But it's no longer natural, and it's certainly not yet cultural, or it's other than the cultures in which it's constituted. As an event, it's already vanished, so it is already has been. But the point about an event is that it exposes something, and I think this is true for Rousseau, even though I'm looking at it through very, very Badiouian, from a very Badiouian perspective. It exposes something that's empty in this situation that you're in, and exposes a whole other possibility for living that if you say, if that really did happen, if that's really true, if that really did happen, well, then none of the things that I see around me can be connected in the way that they are, because what I see around me is injustice and betrayal, and I know that that's all false. Now, that is a very Rousseauistic position too, as you can see, not just in his not just in his clear theoretical works like Discourse on Inequality or on Discourse on the Sciences and Arts, or the social contract itself, but obviously you can see in Emile and his other writings, whether they're Confessions or the Solitary Walker. There's that tension between it's not just nature, but it's not just culture. Something else is possible, and you go forward from it. You don't go backwards from it. It's not just, even though the event is was being. Like it's the was-been par excellence. It's not. It itself is a rupture with the state of nature and with the state of culture, and we have to go forward to re-find. But you're still connected to the was-been that was never a real past. It's an event. You still have to go forward without sort of guarantees, but with the guarantee that, you know, if you keep asking this question, staying faithful to this, something absolutely new and singular will emerge in the situation, which is not false and not a betrayal and not simply the shell of laws. And I think, you know, Rousseau's confessions are really amazing like this because, yeah, they you know, as he says, there's nothing on earth like nothing. There's been nothing like me on the history of the earth. I feel certain about it. I'm going to describe this for you, but it has this strange paradoxical constitution. I hope that answers something about what you were asking.
It does, Justin. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Valerie.
Thank you, Valerie. Knox, please.
All right. Hi. Thanks, Justin. That was fantastic. It's great to see you again, to hear you again, everything. Wonderful.
Great to see you, Knox.
Wonderful. So I know this is like, I'm sure this is like reductive and misses a lot, but like the way I always think about the difference between the Lockean social contract and the Rousseauan social contract is that for Locke, politics just basically supervenes on civil society. So whatever conflicts in civil society just play out in public law, which is why factions just get the laws they want. And if you're powerful, the law serves you, which is why we live in a Lockean world today. And so then the way I think of Rousseau by contrast is that there's a sort of similar emergence story, but then it's not that politics like exacerbates social conflict or the conflicts of civil society, but is rather a kind of shelter from those conflicts. And that's like the role of the general will to kind of, you know, free you, protect you from yourself, protect you from factions, that it's irreducible to any particularity and aggregation or anything like that. And so all these things that bother people about Rousseau, about being forced to be free or totalitarian, all this stuff, like the other way to read it is, no, in this political space where you can actually be free, you are free from the conflicts that Hobbes would call natural social conflating those or whatever. So my question is about what the kind of correlate for that concept of the general will or politics as a space of kind of shelter would be in Badiou, because it sounds like with Badiou, when he says we're going to get rid of the state, or we're going to do what Rousseau can't, there's a kind of idea that those conflicts, those factions that keep coming back in Rousseau, as you identified, might go away. So that's the question. And then I have other worries about like, the cultivation of virtue, and Montesquieu had a similar worry. And I think Spirit of the Law is also an intertext for this.
Absolutely.
But the main question is an issue about, what about that protective space because I'm afraid with Badiou, we would lose that.
Yeah, I think the account you've given of Rousseau is actually makes his sense of liberty quite negative liberty in a way. You're making it this is a freedom from faction as opposed to a positivity, and I think it isn't just a freedom from. It's most definitely not just a negative freedom in Rousseau, but it's a positivity that's so odd and singular that, yes, there's no question Montesquieu is in terms of the spirit of the laws, and that was in fact the reason I used the phrase, but I don't think it's quite, it's an intertext, but what Rousseau is doing is something quite singular and odd. It's not just a refuge from faction. The point about being forced to be free is simply that, well, you know, you haven't participated in the general will. You've by actually participating in being factionalizing, you're actually sheltering yourself from freedom. It's actually a kind of inversion. Like what Rousseau's objection to faction is I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's a really fantastic one of Rousseau's where he says, you know, the individual is literally you're running from what you know is good. You see the good and you're running from it as an individual, and that's exactly what he has against faction. Like and to come back to Valerie's question in a way, I mean, there's a very spiritualist. You could do this in more or less spiritual or ethereal ways, or you could do it in a kind of, you know, hard-nosed, pragmatic way, but in no cases is, I think, the general will a shelter, a shelter from faction. Faction is a shelter from the general will, right? And that's one of the great inversions that Rousseau makes, but then has the problem of he can't account for that except in the very terms of faction that he himself has been trying to dismiss. And so there's a symptom or a collapse in the social contract in particular around that. Around that question. Does that respond?
Yeah, that speaks to it. Chris, can I say one more thing? Just back to
please go for it, Knox. Go for it.
Yeah. So that makes sense to me, Justin. And I really like that torsion or that move. I think that in Rousseau's understanding of our psychology, that our personhood or whatever, that we run to faction because we are fearful of being who we could actually be. Well,
this is the amour propre. In the end, absolutely. You just end up in a kind of a abyssal hall of disaster, right? Like
I agree, so I agree with that reading. But I guess my worry was that if Badiou seems to be taking the line that the bad part of Rousseau is the proto-totalitarian state part of Rousseau, but I'm like, maybe that's the good part. And I'm thinking of like what Hannah Arendt didn't like about Rousseau is then why she said these like abysmal things about American politics in the 60s. Like she didn't understand that concept of Rousseau, that in this space, I take your point about the negative freedom and the way I said it, but that, it is only in this space that you can be free via the general will. Yeah. And then it speaks also to what Karen Green is asking in the chat, but we'll get to that later on. Justin, that's what my concern was. Yeah.
Okay, but that totally makes sense. See, I think that, the problem is not the problem, but when you do make that, if you do, as Badiou has attempted to do, separate those elements in Rousseau, which he himself was incapable of separating, then the state that you're talking about looks very, very different as a result, as I also tried to indicate. And so, for Badiou, in a way, the state is always totalitarian, no matter what a friendly, smiling face it might have on it, right? And it's not the state that, but the state will always be that. He even likes to quote Nietzsche on this, right? Either state and the people says this coldest of cold monsters, but it lies, right? The coldest of cold monsters, that's the image of the state. The friendly, happy, liberal, Hannah Arendtian state for him. Come on, it's just like it's a colder monster as Stalin.
Thanks, Justin.
Brian, please.
Thank you very much,
Brian.
Hey, Justin. Thank you very much for the talk.
And thank you for Chris. This is the best dating agency anything I've been to ever.
Appallingly attractive people on this.
Incredible, and their hair. Go on, sorry, Brian.
Sorry. Okay, my question. I hope won't sound horribly vague and abstract to you, but one of the things I was trying to do when listening to the talk is I was paying attention to some of the figures of paradox that you evoked. And there's something that you got to that strikes me as really crucial, and I'd like you to say more about it if you can. It has to do with the temporal anomalies that the general will is involved in, and that you discuss very eloquently. So specifically, what I'm thinking is, if I used a banal set of terms like the constituted and the constituting applying to something like power, one way one could see the problem of the general will is about how you preserve a vestige of that constituting power, to sound like negative, for it not to sort of dissolve into the constituted, which would be the Burkean and reactionary line that you do. And I think in the back of my mind, I'm also thinking about Badiou's concerns through Maoism of not having identifying the political subject with a sort of pre-existing substance, like hence it being generic and so forth. And it seems to me that the part of your argument, a really crucial part of it, perhaps what Knox is calling the torsion in it, is that the general will seems to be, at the same time from your presentation, a figure by which the constituting survives into the constituted as more than just this Malaman Bastide firework, but that Rousseau is also aware of a kind of potential degeneracy, like of the corruptibility of anything so constituted, and is not glib about the idea of this kind of, oh, well, you can just call the people back on the scene because the people don't exist until they're constituted as the general will, because that would give you faction and so forth. And it seems to me that I'm going to say something wanky about it being a topological view, but that seems to me at the heart of your talk, and the problem of sort of nominating something that is at once constitutive and constituting but can't be ever substantialized,
yes.
And is also inexistent and that must be preserved, but is a vanishing mediator but can't vanish. All these, if you could say more about that, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Well, look, I think you put that much better than I did. And so all of your perplexities, that was exactly that's the problem. It's exactly right. Is that in order to fulfill all of these functions, and as I said, even though like we know that Badiou is exceedingly, loves a mathematical figure. Loves a kind of Mallarméan paradox as well, but it is kind of salutary to reread Rousseau and see that these paradoxes are actually there and in the absolutely incredible, like written in the most incredible way. I'm sorry to say I'm falling in love with Rousseau all over again as a result of this, and Rousseau knows very well. Look. The state of nature is gone, right? Does he even believe in it? Does he even believe in God? Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. Sort of he does, and sort of sometimes he says the opposite, right? He's quite, as one comment, as many commentators have pointed out, he's in constant dialectical and constant dialectic with himself. Literally, he is a genuinely sort of he is that figure of both the proposition and its negation, right? But with the social contract, he really does recognize something that, look, how does it come? He says at the very beginning, how does this change come about? I do not know, right? And that phrase, I do not know, looks like just like, well, I won't talk about that because I don't know, but I'll talk about something else. But you can also take it if you read through the social contract as, I do not know because it is impossible to know about this character. Why is it impossible to know? Because every constituted knowledge that you would want to would try and place this will on this side, on that side, on this, but it is not. It has to be equal, otherwise that we can't consider that any proper foundation has happened at all. We've just got the state of continuation of a collection of loose individuals, and yet we look around, and though we see these empty shells which are full of factions and gossip, something must have happened to constitute. And we know from the from the Bible, or from like Kyrgyz, the founder, the great Spartan founder, or some of the great figures of Rome, which is one of Rousseau's obvious I guess paragons of virtue, is that something must have happened, and something has definitely. There are two heterogeneous states. Now, whether we would call one nature and another culture, or we call them this culture one and culture two, it doesn't matter. Really, for Rousseau in the social contract, it's really, how do we talk about that thing that's neither that nor that? Well, insofar as it's a binding of all and not just an expression of force, man is born free and everywhere he's in chains, of course, and then we can, well, it can't be reduced to this, it can't be reduced to that. How do we think about it? It must be an absolute equality that is presumed everywhere but found nowhere, right? So man is born free is not even a state of nature there. It's a conceptual figure. We can't know it because in order to know it, we'd have to give it in terms that are already established, which are taxonomical, but precisely must betray it because they already come from the constituted side. But do we have to say nothing about it? No, we can say that it has to have, not in the sense of negative freedom, but in the sense of we can determine it negatively to find its absolute, essential, unalienable essence. It must have been an act of equality in which all were bound together in a single moment. Even though we can't point to it or really everything attests to it, even though everything also attests to its betrayal. So that will must have happened, but in order for it to be, you still have to have a figure. You can't, because you can't be bound together unless there's also a declaration of that being bound, and that's the nomination that the legislator, who must be both part of the event and separable from it, because and so is both a singular and a universal figure simultaneously, who names that. So we have the general will, paradoxical, legislator, paradoxical attached to it, and then the constituted citizen subjects who are all both participate in that general will and continue by giving themselves laws equally and freely all the way down the line. However, as they're doing that, actually the figure, the sort of shell states grow up around them, constantly threatening to occlude, betray, and turn this essence into a simulacrum. Anyway, this is a completely crazy answer to your question, but that's the best I can do about how I see Rousseau's situation and why and how he frames this very, very paradoxical figure of what becomes active politics in Badiou.
Magnificent. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you. Could I call on Karen, please?
So sorry, after all of that, I feel very prosaic. But my question had to do with, the very idea of there being such a thing as the general will. How does it, is it just, at some point you said, it's the good. And I just don't know, I suppose my prosaic question is, could you even have this kind of idea of there being something like a general will without having the idea of the good God in the background? After all, there is this beginning, God makes everything good, man corrupts it, that element, the good nature against the corrupt society. And can one think that, unless one has God in the background? But also, God, Rousseau.
What a guy.
As Mary Astell said, way before Rousseau, before men were born free, how is it that all women are born in chains?
Yeah. That's absolutely. Well, first of all, yes, absolutely. I don't see that God has really anything to do with it, necessarily has anything to do with it, except as a name. I mean, as I said before, Rousseau, as you read Rousseau, he's constantly at odds with himself. Like, Jean-Jacques, Rousseau versus Jean-Jacques, for instance. He puts himself at odds. He states himself as being at odds with himself, and he's constantly mutating his position. It's certainly true that he loves baiting the philosophes, and particularly Voltaire, and it comes to a head.
Madame de Châtelet.
Indeed, indeed.
Oh, isn't that shocking? Monarchy, women have power in it. Yes.
Well, this is the biggest. This is exactly right.
Bother with him?
Yes, absolutely, because in the end, yes, he is a misogynist in exactly the ways that you say. I mean, this is why I mentioned Janice's work towards the beginning of this talk, because one of the things about social contract theorists is not a single one. I mean, even Hobbes, does he ever talk about women once? No, he talks.
Do you read Catherine McCauley? I mean, let's read a proper, decent social contract theorist who is a woman and get away from these crazy men. Who you were saying is nothing but paradox, and from paradox anything follows, so why bother?
Okay, well, from paradox not anything follows, except unless you have a very class. So that's not true. Secondly, the point about Badiou's relation to Rousseau is to say, no, there is a thought here that is not, that doesn't actually bear on God. It doesn't bear on sexuation. It also bears on actually the absolute equality, which of all wills, which means actually men, women, children, at some point, this binding has to be not asexuated, but it has to, sexual difference has to be downstream of it too, and so to speak. And so there's a number of different ways in which one can reconfigure Rousseau. If we think of La Nouvelle Héloïse, for instance, in fact, he's not ignoring women, and though he has very many express misogynistic positions too, there's no question. He also has a whole series of positions in which Julie is in fact gives the law to everyone, is the philosopher queen the philosopher queen of the situation. And so even in Rousseau, it's definitely not that simple. He definitely doesn't require God in any received sense or a familiar sense, although he's definitely, I don't think he's an atheist, as I misspoke before, but his God is definitely not a God of a bearded guy in the sky, let's say, and definitely not without revolutionary, whatever his God is, has a genuinely revolutionary flavour, which is picked up by many people, including some in the French Revolution.
Well, thank you. Ali has just snuck in with a question.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Justin. Really great talk. How are you? Look. I'm just wondering about this metaphor of the state being a shell of the spirit of law, or the spirit of the general will. I mean, the state we have today is not even the empty shell. This is the broken plastic bag in which the box comes, in which we have the empty shell. I mean, it is utterly empty and rubbish. As such, I'm wondering if in your Badiouian reading of Rousseau, we say something like the social contract can be seen as an operator of fidelity, although here, specifically in the state, before it becomes particularly oppressive along Badiou's lines. So let's say there's a democratic moment, say that intense optimism of France in like 1793, before everything goes bad. So I guess my question is, can there now be a contract anymore between people and the society, which obviously the word contract is a legal term, right? It's not a properly spiritual, ontological terms Valerie was perhaps suggesting, although it obviously could be seen in such a way. Do we still have any obligations towards a state when the state has obviously no obligations towards us? Is this why, in part, we are seeing something as banal as asking people to just get vaccinated is seeming utterly impossible?
Well, I think, we could also talk about some substance to this, but for Badiou, I think that the essence of the operation of the state is a knowledge power operation which ties predicates to bodies, and then just keeps recounting them. Like, this goes with this goes with every permutation, every combination starts to be just represented and re-represented, and then we end up with both the truth and the falsity, and both of them, all of it's there. We have, and so simultaneously, I think this is why I wanted to invoke Mark Kelly's position about the apparent tension between free-floating global libertarian capitalism, as we see perhaps in New South Wales today, with billionaires advising government directly and like let it rip, or between dictator Dan, as we like to say, who obviously has a biopolitical model and one which has some real concern for the biomedical security of the population on the territory, right? Now, the point for Badiou is both of these are still forms of the state. The state is a much more both basic, fundamental structuring principle that structures apparent antitheses. A paradox is no objection to it. Contradiction is no objection to it. It's just a machine that keeps on counting and counting and counting indefinitely and infinitely. And in response to whatever problem that it has, it sort of doubles down with the same sets of operations, which are those of discernment and classification above all, and now sort of supercharged by databases. But the point for Badiou is that's not do you think that you are going to address this state in one way or another? Like, how do you think you are going to change the opera? How any of us will? Is there going to be, what sort of a general will would there be? Well, the general will that would be that for Badiou is actually at the centre of Rousseau, which contradicts a number of Rousseau contradicts himself in many ways, as I've said before. But the absolute essence of it is: are all human beings equal or not? It's not equality, liberty, fraternity anymore. It's equality must be considered at the centre of it. Do we have some principles that are of absolute equality for everyone? And that's why Badiou speaks about a kind of elementary communism. Well, they're the sorts of, if we do indeed believe that's to be the case, then we have to ask, what do we all have to do in order for that to be implemented? It's not that we don't address the state and say, look, we've got a list of demands. We rather have a process to undergo, which is, if people are indeed equal, like how do we enact that? Literally enact that, and that's why always thinking that lists of demands or petitions to the state essentially are simply part of the almost now going to, absolutely nugatory and part of the situation. And so that's part of the problem for Badiou with respect to Rousseau, and yet part of the greatness of Rousseau is actually there's an unrepresentability about this, but nonetheless there's an actuality to it, as we can attest in procedures that we find in all sorts of odd places, like and unexpected places where a real politics is going on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I see that we've got just about 5 minutes left. I wonder if I could prevail upon you, Justin, for one final question. I'm sorry that we've been working you so hard, and you certainly deserve a break, but I just had a couple of things that I wanted to put before you. You may only want to take one of these, so do feel free to pick and choose. The first one was in what you said in relation to Moses as an image of the operator between diverse states of slavery and freedom. And my sort of somewhat prosaic question, I guess, is does every social contract need its Moses as an individual? And then what's the relationship between this Moses type figure and the legislator? Because it seemed at one point as though you might have been saying that they were equivalent, but as I understand it, wouldn't the legislator need to be brought into being by the contract? So what's the relationship between Moses and the legislator? And then the second question that I had was the way in which you've been talking about the social contracts, and the way in which Badiou talks about the social contract, and Jean-Luc Nancy, and almost all modern and contemporary European thinkers, is that they focus on the Rousseau of le contrat social, of the social contract, to the detriment of the Rousseau of the second discourse, who has a very much more laborious way of relating the state of nature to the social contract in a way which makes the final contracting almost look like the outworking, the inevitable and quite trivial outworking of a process that's been in train for a very long time already. And my question there would be, would you just chalk that up as one of Rousseau's contradictions? And why do you think Badiou and everybody else focuses so incessantly on le contrat social and seems to forget the second discourse? Fantastic
questions. I think I might have been a bit loose. I wanted to just simply, with respect to the figure of Moses, give a widely comprehensible and immediate image of a figure who makes a transition between states, who is also integrally linked to the giving of laws. However, and so Moses would just be one figure among very many who indeed of course Rousseau mentions. I also mentioned Lycurgus, some of the Roman legislators and so on. But it does bring up a very specific question, which is that the general will is general, but each legislator is singular. And so you can only really give, in a way, you can only give instances of them. And unfortunately, I'm going to start sounding a bit Kantian, I'm afraid, soon, like an aesthetic Kantian, by saying you can only give examples rather than give a concept that's going to carry. What you need for a legislator, you can give a few basic conditions which are necessary, is that they will always be they won't always do the same thing, but they will always be a figure. It doesn't have to be an individual figure. It could be Romulus and Remus, for instance, although that's not exactly the most opportune or virtuosic of the examples. But Romulus and Remus are clearly a double already, right? So I don't see that the legislator needs to be linked to a particular figure, but they need to perform a particular function. However, the conditions one can give to them are quite minimal. If you want more than that, then you're just going to have to start pointing, well, here's one, and here's another great figure, and here's another great figure, and here's Confucius, and here's the Buddha, and here's, you could do something like that. But that would also perhaps mean that there's a certain variegation starts to enter the concept, which then vitiates its consistency, and that would be another question. The second point you raise is it's not just one of Rousseau's inconsistencies, but one of the things about the social contract is that it's clearly it's so reductive that makes it so appealing, right? It's so influential. Everyone carried that book around over in their breast pocket. It's absolutely the critical text. It's slim. It's easy to read. And it seems to have a certain clarity, a clarity of formalization, whereas the elaborate procedure that Rousseau talks about the when he's talking about the incredible, it's almost proto-Hegelian if you want to think about the kind of phenomenology of spirit and I feel that there's something, but it's also I would have to talk about this at another time and with much more detail. But very simply, I think that it's still, for someone like Nancy or Badiou or all the other, I guess, French thinkers you're speaking about, even all of this elaborate procedures of laborious, you called them, of that working out. In the end, in the social contract, a certain essence of the problem of transition is figured that sort of circumvents the actual historical work and brings it back to a kind of conceptual structure. So that's my very simple answer to you. One is a kind of history, one's a drama of the concept, and the other one's gives a much more structural, minimalist account of the paradoxes of the concept.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for that particular answer. Thank you so much for being so generous with all your answers. And particularly thank you as well for engaging so thoughtfully with the previous papers in the series. I really did appreciate the way that you wove in your ideas with what people have been saying before. Please, everybody, do join me in very warmly thanking Justin Clemens. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Chris.
I had one question in the chat. Will this recording of this be available? It will indeed. I've put the link to the channel where it will be available in the chat. So if you want to watch this back in a few days' time, do please keep an eye on that channel. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Thank you for everybody who asked questions. A really rich time, giving me lots to think about. I'm sure we all have lots to think about. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.